God's intention for you and for me, it hasn't changed. We've been promised a future filled with hope, and the storm does not change that. The chaos doesn't change that. The confusion you might be feeling doesn't change that. And maybe you feel like Jesus is sleeping. And I'm just saying, can you have faith in him? He is Lord of the whole journey, and he's Lord of this moment. What I'm pretty sure is that there are some of us in here, and we might be in the middle of some chaos. Me too. What I know is that we are in very good company. You know, the disciples of Jesus at one point were in the middle of some chaos too. And Mark chapter 4, in verse 35 begins like this. It says, "That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, 'Let us go to the other side.'" So what was happening here is that Jesus had spent a bunch of hours teaching and healing people. He had had a very full day, and they were ready for rest. And so that evening, he and his disciples got in the boat to go to the other side of the sea. And he told them, that's where we're going, to the other side. Now, the other side actually lay at the end of a 6-mile journey. I mean, and to us, that's no big deal, unless we understand Jewish culture. Because to the Jews, who he was speaking to and who his disciples were, to the Jews, the other side of this Sea of Galilee was an expression that described an area called the Decapolis. And basically, that's a 10-city region that was primarily inhabited by Romans, those who were pagan worshipers. And so to the Jews, the thought of going to the Decapolis, and that was a place to avoid. You wouldn't want to go there. That was inhabited by evil gods. And so it was off limits to any respectful Hebrew. And so Jesus is bringing his disciples directly to this region. And I'm going to give you a spoiler alert and tell you what happened when they got to the other side. So when they eventually did get to the other side, the first encounter of Jesus and his disciples when they got there was with a man who was demon-possessed, and he was living actually among some tombs near this herd of pigs. And so we have this picture here of an individual. It's in total bondage, and he was so tormented that he couldn't even be around people, and he was out of his mind, and he was confused, and he was suffering, and he would cry out at night, and he would gnash himself with stones, just seeking relief from his pain. And see, no God-fearing Jew would ever come near this place. But Jesus often goes where others won't in order to bring the peace that others can't. And so we can only imagine what was going through the minds of the disciples when they, got off their ship and it landed, and this demon-possessed man comes running toward them. And so in the story, we find out that Jesus, ultimately prayed for this man, and he was now set free. He was free from everything that had tormented him. And Jesus tells that man, he says, what I want you to do is actually go back to your own people, to those Gentiles, those pagan-worshiping Gentiles, and I want you to tell them everything that had happened. Tell them all that had happened to you. And so what's about to happen is that this man was going to his own people in the Decapolis. This former demoniac would now be talking about Jesus to the very same people who had chained his hands and chained and shackled his feet. And he would be explaining the miracle to the same people who had heard him crying out, day and night. So this man went away and began to tell the people in this region called the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed at the story, and they are looking at him as evidence. I mean, you talk about a tough mission. Here's a guy who was not long ago, right, possessed by demons, and then now all of a sudden he's the only missionary in an area that to the Jew, remember, was the most pagan place you could possibly go to. Interestingly enough, this area called the Decapolis would ultimately become one of the strongest part in the hub of the early Christian community that began in that world, and it started with that man. Right, so Jesus and his disciples were taking a night voyage across the Sea of Galilee and endured all the hardship that I'm going to talk about, and they endured all of that only to help one man. A whole day and night, a round-trip travel to see the salvation of one man who would ultimately impact a culture. So that's the end of the story, right? That's where they were headed. That was the purpose. That was the win. Only the disciples didn't know that. So the next verse, after Jesus said we're going to the other side, in Mark verse 36, he says, leaving the crowd behind, they took him, Jesus, as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with them. And then a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. You know Jesus. So see, as soon as Jesus got in the boat, he grabbed a pillow and put his head on it. You know what that was? That was his do not disturb sign. Right? Because when you're casually, like when you're not really going to sleep deep, you just like lean back and do this. But when you pull out a pillow and a blanket, you are taking an NAP nap. Right? It's the don't bother me nap. Right? So Jesus took a pillow. He was going to sleep. And he did. Now, several of these disciples were veteran fishermen. I mean, they'd fished this lake for years. They grew up on its banks. Its shore had been their playground. They knew every current and every mood. They were very handy with boats. So they're thinking, Jesus is in safe hands when he's in our boat. This was their realm, and he could just leave the sailing to them, or so they thought. So now they're crossing this sea, and the Bible tells us that the storm of hurricane proportions arose unexpectedly. Well, of course the disciples were taken by surprise, right? As fishermen, they knew what the sky looked like and the water looked like before a storm. They never would have left the shore if they'd known that a storm was coming. So they were a little surprised to find the waves beating against their boat. And they were afraid. And yet, in the middle of the storm, Jesus is, right, sleeping. Isn't it amazing that Jesus can be sleeping in a boat with a storm raging? And isn't it amazing that Jesus can be sleeping in our boat when we panic, right? When there's problems in our family or with our spouse or with our kids, or we've gotten a bad diagnosis or experienced a job loss or have financial problems. See, Jesus knew that they were going to be fine because he said, let's go to the other side. He didn't say, let's get to the middle and we're going to sink. He said, we're going to go to the other side. And can I just say, he's not finished with you either. And continuing, verse 38 says, the disciples woke him and said to him, teacher, don't you care that we drown? Okay, so the disciples were like drenched to the skin. They were terrified at the raging winds, and it grew so terrifying to them that the Bible says they woke Jesus. Now, this waking was not just a casual, hey, Jesus, get up. The actual word this word awoke, the literal meaning of that word is, it's the same word that's used when raising from the dead. So it's like, Jesus! Right? It's a pretty big shaking. They jerked him up. And they said, don't you care about us? Can't you see we're perishing? Jesus, Jesus. And sometimes that's what we say, Jesus, don't you care? Right? Don't you care that my marriage is failing, that my body is sick, that my family is hurting? See, God knew that the storm you're facing was coming. And he is with you as you are on the journey to where he has called you to go. So verse 39 says, Jesus says he got up and he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, quiet. Some translations say, peace, be still. Then the wind calmed down. Wind died down, it was completely calm. So Jesus, he barely had time to wipe the sleep out of his eyes before he had to, take care of the situation. He's rebuking the wind and the waves, and then there became this perfect peacefulness. One word from him, and the wind and the waves would do his will. One word from Jesus calms any storm. Maybe Jesus is just waiting on you and me to call on his name in the middle of our storm, so that with just one word from him, he can bring peace to our soul. So then in verse 40, he said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? See, he turns to his buddies, his disciples, and he says, why are you afraid? And he asked them why they had no faith. Now, he wasn't talking about faith in the abstract or, faith in a vacuum, because faith always, always, always has an object. It's linked to something or to someone. We exercise faith in a pilot when we board the airplane. Hello. We have faith in the bank when we hand over our deposit. And so Jesus is asking his disciples, why do you have no faith in me? In me. Jesus challenged them, why did you fear? Why don't you have any faith? Couldn't you just trust me? Trust me? And sometimes I think he asks the same questions of us. The presence of Jesus on board doesn't necessarily guarantee a smooth passage. What we're promised is his presence in the storm. We're promised his presence in the middle of the chaos. See, he knew that they would encounter a storm. He knew, and he's in our boat, and he is at rest. See, he wasn't sleeping because he didn't care. He was sleeping because this was no big deal, not in the big picture. And can I just say, the same God who called you to the other side, he's not panicked in the middle. You might be. I have been, but he's not. And see, God's intention for you and for me, it hasn't changed. We've been promised a future filled with hope, and the storm does not change that. The chaos doesn't change that. The confusion you might be feeling doesn't change that. And maybe you feel like Jesus is sleeping. And I'm just saying, can you have faith in him? He is Lord of the whole journey, and he's Lord of this moment. He may not speak peace to every wave, but he will give us peace in the middle of them. See, peace doesn't come with fewer problems. Peace comes when we trust Jesus. He knows where you're headed. He knows you're headed to the mission in front of you. He knows the purpose for which you have been born. He knows the place he's calling you to go. See, for Jesus and the disciples, the place he was calling them to go in that moment was seeing one man be set free who would ultimately influence thousands. So what is it for you? Well, I promise you, here's a promise, that there will be a storm between your now and your then. Thanks, Holly. You're welcome. And I also promise you that Jesus is right there in the middle of it.
At TBN, our mission is to use every available means to reach as many individuals and families as possible with the life-changing gospel of Jesus Christ.
Thank you for helping make the gospel of grace go around the world.
Without you, we couldn't do it. God bless you.